Well, tonight we continue our education on all things marijuana. We learned a lot in a previous show about what goes into actually cultivating and making sure that they have as safe of a product as possible. Tonight, we're going to learn about the independent labs who make sure they have a safe product. Let's start with an introduction.
Sure. My name is Chris Hadalla. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at ProVerde Laboratories.
Now, most of us didn't even know ProVerde existed.
We just celebrated our 5th birthday here in Milford. We're very excited to be here that long. As a small startup business, 5 years is a pretty remarkable achievement, especially in an industry that is a challenging industry just inherently.
But now, we just went through a town meeting, and we're going to go through a second referendum. And you made a pretty compelling argument when you got up and explained to the town meeting members, how come you're in Milford?
Well, I live in Milford. I've been here for 18 years. I moved here to join Waters Corporation in 2000, and I love the community. I don't like to commute in the traffic of Boston. I like being able to go to a small town hardware store. I like the Claflin Hill Symphony. I like that community spirit, and I like to be part of that. And so when we were looking for a site to establish our laboratory, of course, Milford became my first point to look at.
Now, one of the things that I know most people have no clue. Okay, there's young Chris wants to set up his company and says, I'm going to test marijuana. So I'm going to go rent some space, spend $100, and I'm in the testing business. Probably not that simple, right?
Not quite. No, it's actually quite complex. There's a lot of hurdles. Number one, it's an industry that has no foundation. So there's no established testing methods for cannabis. The regulatory guidelines are, in the early days, somewhat ill-defined. Everybody's kind of just trying to find their way, trying to understand what contaminants should we be looking for, what limits are acceptable, what's appropriate concentrations for cannabis concentrates in terms of THC. So there are a lot of questions that in the early days, we're still struggling to answer some of these questions, but those are on top of the additional requirements when setting up a lab. A typical piece of laboratory equipment can cost between $100,000 to $500,000. So it takes a good $1 million to establish a testing facility. Then you need trained personnel. I have a PhD in analytical chemistry, but it takes more than me. We need qualified staff who are attentive to detail, have integrity. We're working with a controlled substance, so you have to trust your employees. You have to like them because you work with them every day. And so it's almost like finding that perfect storm of you have to have the capital, you have to have the trained personnel, and the resources to do all that, and then hopefully support of the regulatory process, the state and the local government.
So you're putting out over $1 million cash before you even get started, just to outfit the lab.
Yeah, I mean, so there's portions of the equipment that are leased, so we didn't pay $1 million
Well, not cash, but one
yes.
way or another,
Yep.
$1 million under your name is now on the hook.
Yep, about 1.4 in ProVerde. Yep.
Wow. And then you have to hire people who are trained, and I mean, it's wonderful that those are good jobs for Milfordians.
Yep. We probably increased our staff. We added on 4 people within the last probably 4 months. We seem to be, our business is gearing up so fast that we almost can't keep up with hiring. I just hired another person today. So it's very exciting. She'll be starting on Monday. And we still have open positions, so we're always looking for qualified chemists.
How hard is it to get chemists out here?
It can be challenging. Milford's a smaller community. Certainly a lot of the people with the appropriate skill set might work in Cambridge or Boston. So we do have some challenges finding qualified technicians.
You know, it's funny, when I set up our pharmaceutical plant out in Worcester, I didn't even bother trying to draw from Cambridge, Newton, that area, because Cambridge was Mecca for biotech.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed at how many people were applying, and they live in Newton. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're 5 miles away from Mecca. right? Why would you want to commute all the way to Worcester? And then they said, it's a lot easier. You know, it may take me 45 minutes to get there, but I'm doing 60 miles an hour, so I'm more relaxed, whereas it takes me 50 minutes to get the last 5 miles into Cambridge.
Yeah. You know, I always joke that I have a significant local preference to hiring, and part of that is because on snow days I don't want to be the only one in the lab.
So how big is ProVerde now?
We have about 16 employees.
16?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and as I said, a lot of those are new employees and always expanding.
So now when we think of testing, and I can think you want to test for efficacy, you want to test for safety. What do you test for? I mean, all joking aside, somebody says you're testing for pot.
Yep.
You know, it's somebody out back saying, oh, this is good stuff.
When we first established ProVerde Laboratories, you would be surprised how many people called and said, I'll be a tester. That was always a good phone call to get. No, but seriously, there's a lot of things that are critical for understanding the product and the product life cycle. Certainly if we're talking about cannabinoid concentrations, that's the first thing where we're looking at how much is in it. We want to make sure that facilities like Sierra have the ability to put appropriate concentrations, especially of the psychoactive components on the packaging. That's just crucial for patient dosing. But there's other ways that we can use that same measurement. So for instance, if they're going to make 100 or 1,000 lozenges, how homogeneous, how reproducible is that dosing from one lozenge to the next? So we also do something called homogeneity testing, where we're actually seeing how reproducible is it. Another area that we're doing a lot of testing is stability testing. So normally if you buy any product in the grocery store or pharmacy, it's going to say
Best used
if used by or expires by.
Expiration date.
Problem with cannabis is nobody knows how long it's stable in a flower form, in an extract form, or in a tincture form. All these different matrix components can change the stability of a product as it sits on a shelf. And so that's crucial for producers to understand. If they produce a product and it doesn't sell within how many months, 2 months, 3 months, is it time to remove it from the shelf and then have it go for destruction?
So now let's start with basic. Are you only testing local, or do you take samples from across the country or globally?
Because of federal regulation, we can only accept marijuana that has THC in it from Massachusetts. We do some testing for industrial hemp products, which industrial hemp is defined under the federal regulation as being less than 0.3% THC. And so a lot of these products have no THC at all. They have another, I call it a cousin cannabinoid, CBD. CBD is a cannabinoid that has been very effective at controlling seizures, reducing anxiety. It's been effective in treatment of Crohn's disease, so there's a lot of other conditions that can be treated effectively with CBD. These CBD-based products having no THC can be shipped across the country and even internationally. We test for about 18 different countries internationally.
Okay, so now when I think about this, there's a therapeutic value, an efficacy, and I want to make sure that I have a known amount. You know, it's like anything that I ingest. Too much can be bad, too little can be of no use. So you're testing different products for, is it just THC? Is it CBD? Is it a profile?
Yep. So there's over 100 cannabinoids, over 120 probably, and our profile right now quantitates 10 different cannabinoids. Of those, THC is the only cannabinoid that has any significant psychoactivity. It's the only one that's going to get you stoned. But the other cannabinoids, while they don't have that psychoactive effect, they definitely have some therapeutic benefits, all of which aren't fully understood. There's a lot more research that needs to happen. A lot of it historically has been prohibited just because all of those are wrapped into the...
And I mean, that's part of what absolutely annoys me when you've got political science majors trying to dictate chemistry. Because I keep reading that federal guidelines and laws prohibit a lot of research on cannabinoids.
Yep. And yet the federal government has patents on therapeutic uses of cannabinoids for Alzheimer's and things like
Well,
that.
you mean, you think about Parkinson's.
Yep.
Okay, so if you get something that doesn't have a high level of THC, I'm not going to get the high effect. But if I got Parkinson's, I could limit my tremors.
Absolutely.
Do I really care why? No, as a patient, just help my quality of life. But wouldn't it be nice if we could do more research?
Yeah, we've seen this a lot with, especially with parents with children that have epilepsy. Long before there were any kind of rules that permitted them to treat their children with CBD or cannabis products, they were using it. They don't care what the federal or state
Right.
law said because it's about their children's quality of life. And if you're going to do something illegal to make the quality of life better for your child, a lot of parents took that route with no regrets.
How could you condemn a parent who's trying to do what's right and make their child's life a little better?
That's a tough decision because what the parent thinks is best for the child is different than what the federal government thinks is best for the child. And, you know, it's an
But
argument
if it was
that's
the
still being played out.
FDA,
Yeah.
if it was the CDC, if it was somebody that I have some respect for their scientific knowledge, I know not a lot of respect, but some, then I could see the FDA saying, be careful, you know, because, okay, we want low THC, high CBD product. And we only want so many milligrams. Because we've done research, oh my God, we've done research to show it. But when you got the senator from some square state saying that marijuana is just bad, and you sit there and say, wait a minute, how can you say that if it helps the child?
Yeah. Oftentimes in those situations, they have that position until they have a child or a loved one
Here you go.
who has a malady that can, you know, benefit from that. And it's encouraging when I see people actually change their position, but it has to hit home first.
Well, I mean, there's always been the theory that if congressional offspring had to go first, a lot of military actions would never happen.
Yep.
You know, or when you talk about, even in Milford, we had town meeting way back when, where somebody said, just don't take care of these kids from Texas, and they won't come. I said, really? I don't know any of us in Milford that would look at a sick child and turn our back on them. So in theory,
Yeah.
You can have a lot of good things in theory until your child is shaking or having an epileptic seizure. And then you say, okay, if I treat them this way, it'll help them. I'm not going to, because I don't think it's the right thing theoretically.
Yeah. We meet a lot of people who are senior citizens who have been conditioned that marijuana is bad, but yet they suffer from debilitating arthritis. And when we show them what a cannabinoid therapy can do for them without getting them stoned, where they can get relief from their pain within 10 or 15 minutes, that's phenomenal
But
to
see,
watch.
again, when you think about it, we grew up, us old people, reefer madness. You know, I remember when I was at Holy Cross, there was the Worcester, a research house that did a study to prove that marijuana was the ultimate aphrodisiac. And they took two monkeys, I can't remember the species, kept them separated for a while, gave them a cannabis treatment, put them together, and they became very amorous. Therefore, it's an aphrodisiac. Of course, you know, being a chemist, you looked and said, but where's the control? The two monkeys next to them that weren't treated, if you kept them apart for long enough, did they become amorous? Well, we never ran controls.
Can't run that. Yeah.
And then you find out why. They were paid to prove that there were negative effects of cannabis.
Yep. I mean, that stigma is still there. 5 years ago when we started ProVerde Laboratories, I was, as I said, I was working for Waters Corporation. It was a big corporate job, and I felt like I was making a decision that was turning my back on my colleagues in good science to go study cannabis, because I was afraid of being stigmatized by doing that. And so I literally made the conscious decision that I was going to walk away from my professional career to do this. And what happened was exactly the opposite. I was embraced by the scientific community. I garnered respect from my colleagues, who were envious that I would go on such a venture into that illicit world of cannabis, but bring good science to it. Good science which hadn't been, for the most part, applied to the cannabis industry since Prohibition, so for over 70 years.
Bringing any science.
Yeah. So other countries, Israel has been doing beautiful scientific research on cannabis for 60 years.
Now you're going to annoy me. I mean, you know, you sit there and say, I remember when the whole edict came out about stem cells. You know, everybody was so worried that you couldn't use embryonic stem cells because people were going to have abortions, which was the most stupid thing I've ever heard in my life. Especially when we said, but this work is being done on adult stem cells. You think we're harvesting adult stem cells by murdering people?
Hopefully not.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you let the politics get in the way of the science, but you know, wait a minute, why do I want other countries and their scientists and their companies to be able to do research and get ahead of us on anything? So, if it's marijuana, the plant, it has to come from Massachusetts?
Yep. Under federal regulations, it has to stay within a state.
So there's no real logic. It's just we're going to keep it from going interstate.
Yeah, it's very challenging having a lab. As I already said, it can be very costly to set up a lab. Rhode Island is 20 minutes from me. And if I want to test for Rhode Island patients, I have to build another $1.4 million laboratory 20 minutes away. The financial sense of that, it just doesn't compute. And yet, Rhode Island needs decent testing labs. We are looking at expanding because there is a need for that there. It doesn't make sense to spend that kind of capital investment, but there's no other alternative, because if I'm on this side of the border in Rhode Island, I'm legal, and if I'm on this side of the border in Massachusetts, I'm legal, and both of those are state activities. Being in position is a state activity, but crossing that line is a federal activity, and that's what's illegal. And so if they catch you crossing that line, that moment that you cross the line,
Even samples.
Even samples, even small, minuscule samples.
I was going to say, even a milligram that has no value.
Correct.
As far as getting high.
Yep.
Again, I love when politicians get in the way of science.
Yep.
So the people in Rhode Island, if they legalize marijuana, unless somebody's going to put up millions of dollars, how are they going to get tested?
There's some labs in Rhode Island already.
Oh, okay.
But when people don't have access to capital, what happens is people tend to build what is not necessarily an appropriate lab. They don't have the sensitivity to detect pesticides at low levels. They're not doing heavy metal testing, which all of these tests require expensive instrumentation, extensive training, high-level staffing. And if one person sets up a small lab, chances are it's not going to be quite the same caliber to do that sensitive testing that's required to really ensure consumer safety.
So you're running into the same thing we did with clinical labs, where you had Chris's diagnostic lab and taco stand. I'm being facetious, but the level was amazing, and the FDA finally had to put in CLIA, the Continuing Lab Improvement Act of '88, to say, this is the minimum that you have to meet, which isn't overly exciting, but at least you couldn't sell tacos out of the same building.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. Sometimes when I see some of these smaller labs and I see their lab reports, and they'll say pesticides, none detected. What does that mean? To me, none detected is one hand clapping, because I don't know what that lower limit of detection, I don't know how good or how capable they are of measuring pesticides down to a relatively low level. So none detected, it doesn't tell me what their capability was. And so it's a meaningless number. And yet I see lab certificates from all over the country that say pesticides, none detected.
But there's no standard. It's not like somebody saying, it's not that any pesticide is acceptable, but the minimum so your lower limit of detection has to be so many nanograms.
Yep.
Then at least you'd feel comfortable that if you say none detected.
Yep, and so Massachusetts was one of the first states to start implementing limits of detection and saying you have to be able to test pesticides down to 10 parts per billion. So that's the other hand of that hand clapping. So if I say none detected down to 10 parts per billion,
At least I know.
I know. And so most states have followed suit. So states like California are in the process of implementing their testing protocols, which include those very sensitive limits of detection. And most other states, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, these are all states that have these testing protocols in place. Minnesota, New York.
If you're down 10 ppb on tissue, so plant, it's not just a little isocratic HPLC that costs $15,000.
Nope. That's a $500,000 piece of equipment, and realistically it's two different pieces of equipment. Pesticides are such a broad class of compounds. It's not 10 or 20, it's hundreds, thousands of different classes of compounds, and so they have such different properties. We actually are going to need to apply two different technologies to address those. Liquid chromatography and gas chromatography, each with very sensitive mass spectrometry for detection. Each one of those pieces of equipment is close to $500,000 just for the pesticide testing.
Yeah, I remember, we're involved in my lab in doing sample prep for wastewater and drinking water. Certain EPA methods, it's GC mass spec. Others is LC mass spec, mass spec. Mm-hmm. And every time they start adding that mass spec, it goes cha-ching, cha-ching. And it's certainly done well at Waters,
yep.
But when you got to come up with that kind of money, it hurts.
Yep, and it's hard to explain to regulators that as they have more sensitive requirements, each decimal place they add on adds, it's a factor of 10 times more expensive.
Yeah.
So it's
it's
daunting.
No longer go to a UV detector at 254. Okay, we'll go to 228 or 230. No, it's not $5,000 to add the cadmium instead of the mercury.
Yeah.
Now, we talk about hemp. Mm-hmm. What is hemp?
What is hemp? That's a good question. Hemp has been used for thousands of years for fiber, for rope,
We
for
made
fabric.
ropes for boats.
Yep. Probably one of the largest, and it's still in the marijuana family, it's the cannabis family. One of the largest cultivators was the U.S. government for a long time for rope production. Because it is in the cannabis family, it does have traces of THC in it. And somewhere along the line, somebody in the federal government drew a line in the sand and said on less than 0.3% THC is hemp, greater is marijuana. And that line is not a botanical definition, it's a federal definition.
So the ropes that held the battleships, you couldn't smoke it because it didn't have enough THC in it to have any high potential.
Sure.
Okay, so why would I test it? I'm a hemp seller.
Yep.
I have hemp. I want to sell it. Why would I pay you to test my hemp?
So in today's market, certainly they're using hemp for a lot of things like building materials, fabric, composite materials. Cars have hemp panels in them now. You can build whole houses out of hemp. What we're talking about is more dietary hemp products. So either hemp seed oil, which has no cannabinoid in it. It's actually the seed of the hemp plant that is pressed, very similar to sunflower seed oil. It does not have the capability of producing cannabinoid. And yet during the collection process, sometimes there's a little bit of trace THC or CBD that's brushed off on it. And so we do see traces, but these are ultra trace levels of contamination. Where we see more higher levels of cannabinoid would be from the CBD. So like cannabis, like marijuana, it is producing cannabinoids. But instead of producing the THC psychoactive cannabinoid, it's going to produce predominantly cannabidiol or CBD. And as I said, that's the one that has been
So
really
the diol is the one with therapeutic, but I can ingest it, smoke it, whatever, and I'm not going to get high.
Correct.
Okay, so now I'm back. I make hemp. Why do I want it tested?
It's the same, for us it's the same as for marijuana. So If a hemp producer is going to make a tincture or something to address anxiety or Crohn's disease, they want to make sure that there's no microbiological contaminants. Hemp is typically grown outdoors in big acres of crop fields, so pesticide use or pesticide contamination from neighboring fields can be an issue, so we're certainly going to want to test products for pesticide contamination, especially when you think about pesticide contamination on a hemp crop. Whatever that pesticide concentration is in the hemp flower, and this is the same for marijuana, if you extract the cannabinoids, you extract the CBD.
And I'm concentrating.
You're concentrating the CBD, you're concentrating the THC, but you're also concentrating these toxins, the pesticides. And so your pesticide concentration will go up by a significant factor, 5 to 10 times from what it was in the flower.
So now I can understand. So if I want to sell my hemp to somebody who's making a therapeutic product, I'm doing it really for safety.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
To show that, hey, by the way, I'm not spraying paraquat or some of the other pesticides all over it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know, once it's in, I don't know how the heck you get it off the plant.
There's chemical ways, chromatographic ways for purification, but it gets very expensive.
I was going to say, wait a minute, how much is that going to cost me?
So when we first started a lot of our testing for industrial hemp, the hemp industry is much more mature in that it's been going on for a lot longer. There's less regulations for shipping across state lines and internationally. And I think one of the things that happened about the time ProVerde started testing is there was a lot of hemp extracts being sourced out of China. And somehow it came to light that these products were heavily contaminated with heavy metals.
That makes me feel good when I think of the infant formula and all the issues with the heavy metals and the...
They weren't worried about pesticide use. They were growing in contaminated soil. Cannabis plant, which includes industrial hemp, is really good at soil remediation. So if you have contaminants in your soil,
it'll take them out of the soil and put it in the tissue.
Yes, but then if you extract that, then that's in your product. And so the industrial hemp or the CBD industry kind of got a black eye because people were sourcing toxic contaminated material. So then what happened, it was almost a overreaction, but maybe not overreaction, but the really responsible producers said, well, wait a minute, I want to prove to my clients or to my customers that we're doing everything we can to prove that our material is sourced appropriately, it's free from heavy metals, it's free from pesticides, it's free from microbiological contaminants, it's free from solvents. And so a lot of our clients in the early days said, do any test you can do. I'll pay for it. I don't care. Do every test that you can do because I want to show my customers that I'm doing everything I can to ensure their safety.
So it's a sales tool. I could go to my customers and say, buy it from me. Here's a ProVerde certificate.
Yep.
And you test for 10 different cannabinoids. Yep. So that's more for the DEA saying there's no hallucinogenic, there's no high potential coming out of this. Yep. But paraquat comes to mind, but there's a lot of other pesticides.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of them.
Just like we test in drinking water. There's a reason we test for, 152 different entities.
Yeah.
But that was a way I could sell my hemp versus Joe, who imports it from China, who wasn't sure what was in his.
It is kind of a marketing tool, but it's actually, for a lot of our clients, it's more than that. It's a social responsibility. They want to make sure, it's not just to sell it, they want to make sure that they're doing no harm. And so some people are only using it for marketing, and those people oftentimes will alter a certificate. We've seen people take our certificates, or a certificate that I provided to one client, they'll download it from the internet, they'll change the numbers, they'll put their name on it and sell it with their product. Those people are not legitimate.
Those are just criminals.
And we see a lot of that. But the majority of our customers, they're committed to demonstrating that their products are high quality, that they can prove through extensive testing. They test at the raw material stage, sometimes when they buy the hemp material, sometimes after it's been extracted to make sure that there were no pesticides that were concentrated. Then they formulate it, they'll test it again, then they'll put it in a package to make sure that there was no contamination that happened during the packaging. You know, suppose one of the packaging machines had a contamination issue.
Well, I mean, you look and you say mold,
Yep.
you know, fungi. We've seen it with pharmaceuticals that if you're not careful.
Framingham.
Exactly. You know, here you are, you could have the most pure compounds. In the packaging phase,
Yep.
you contaminate it.
And so we do test for multiple stages in a process. And so, again, it tells me a lot about my client. Are they just testing the final product? Those are probably the people who just want a marketing document. The people who are testing where they don't need to test upstream to monitor and optimize those processes, they're concerned about quality. And it's not just marketing.
And that's, now they're paying you 5 times because you're doing the same
Absolutely.
tests.
It's not cheap, and I wish I could do it more economically. But as I said, you know, when you have
I wish I could be young, thin, and have hair. You know, that would be a nice thing, but a fat old bald man looks at me in the mirror and says, no.
So, yeah, it's the reality, though. Testing is very expensive, and I think I think a lot of people who are in the industrial hemp production side, as I said, it's a little bit more mature, and so those people understand that the nature of testing. I think a lot of people who started in the cannabis industry even a year or 2 years ago, testing wasn't an accepted commonplace thing. And so to all of a sudden have that additional cost burden on them for production was unanticipated.
Well, I would think too, well, you know, when I think of, okay, whichever way you start, you end up with an oil or something that you're now going to apply to a food. You know, you talked about stability studies, very common in every drug, in everything that we do, even in food. I mean, I was always amazed that Hershey peanut butter cups tasted so much better when I went to Hershey and we were doing the QC and you could take one off the line and they told me, yeah, that's because they're fresh and what you get in the grocery store is 90 days old.
Big difference.
Yeah, you know, so now you sit there and say, okay, I'm doing all this testing, but I want to make sure that I'm giving you a consistent product. Because if I'm adding, take, what is it, gummy bear? Seems to be something that becomes popular. The bane of all our testing existence.
I hate them.
Hey, we all hate gummy bears for my teeth, you know, but do you have what, a mig, half a mig? I mean, how much THC is in a typical gummy bear?
10 to 50 MIGs.
Really?
They pack them.
Holy
Those bears are
moly.
stuffed.
So you got 10 to 50 milligrams. But now I'd be more worried that it's all in the gummy bear's tail.
Yeah, the gummy bears are pretty small.
Small, but what happens if you get a brownie? That's pretty big.
Yeah.
And if it's all concentrated, I mean, the homogeneity.
Yep. Most of the people that we work with, when we started testing with Sierra, we've taken their brownies and we've cut it into 4, 8 pieces and tested those individually to make sure not only is one brownie the same as the next brownie, but even within a brownie, because sometimes at the concentration that might be in a brownie, a patient might want to just take a bite of it and then save the rest for the next day. And so it's really critical that when they're making up the batter for the brownie, that it's mixed thoroughly so that you get a homogeneous brownie. And we can cut that brownie into 8 sections and test each one independently to show that each portion of the brownie has the same concentration.
Because that makes more sense, because if I had concentration on the south corner of the brownie, I could be getting 4 or 5 times what I think, and then
Absolutely.
tomorrow I get nothing.
Yep.
But now a gummy bear, I'm always fascinated with these little critters. Is there batter? I mean, I thought some people build it into the, I don't know what technically, the gummy,
Yep.
and other people spray it, or...
I know people who buy gummy bears and they melt them down so they can add the cannabinoid to it and then re-pour it into a mold. So that's the easy way out. You can spray the cannabinoid on, as you say, and then it's only on one side of the gummy. So if you don't eat a whole gummy, if you choose to bite it, you know, your dose depends on which
Which end you bought.
Yes. Gummies are not rocket science to make, so you can make them pretty easily from scratch. And so a real producer is going to just make them from scratch, and they'll do the appropriate mixing to make sure that the gel solution is homogeneous in terms of cannabinoid concentration. And then they will do multiple testing from their batch to make sure that the first gummy that was poured into the mold has the same concentration as the last gummy that was poured into a mold.
But now when I start thinking about it, the immediate tests, various pesticides. Mm-hmm. We know, I don't know how many you test for, but...
We test for about 55, I think.
Wow.
We don't report all of them right now because we're in the process of validating it. So being ISO accredited, we have to prove to our accrediting body that our methods are sound, and so there's a lot of documentation.
But that's just good laboratory practices.
Yep. And so I think right now we have probably about 26 that have been validated, and we're in the process of validating. We're always, our plan, we feel it's our responsibility to continually increase the number of pesticides.
This is going to be the same game we get faced with water. Okay, as soon as they know you can test for these 26, they're going to use something else.
Yep.
Then when you add that, it's like, the synthetic steroids. Oh, they have a test for this, we'll go do another synthetic version. So, but there's 50 that's already on your target list.
Yep.
Well, that's good. That should take care of the vast majority.
It's most of the ones that are commonly used for cannabis production.
Now, heavy metals. I'm not sprinkling heavy, I don't walk around and sprinkle heavy metals on my plants.
You do if you're a cannabis cultivator. Most of the heavy metal contamination comes from the nutrients that you apply.
Okay.
And so the problem, most people think, well, it comes from either my soil or my water.
That's where I'd come from.
And it can, but the thing is you put your plant in the soil, and however heavy metal is in that pot is in that pot. The difference with nutrients is nutrients are sourced from natural materials, and so oftentimes there are heavy metal contaminants that are in your nutrients, and you're applying that day after day after day.
So the fertilizer basically that makes these plants grow bigger, thicker,
yep,
makes more money. If they're not careful, I mean, Michael was telling me how he feeds 10 mega ohm water to these little devils. I said, that's not fair. We don't get 10 mega ohm water. I wouldn't want to drink 10 mega ohm water, but that's cleaner than we get for us.
Yeah,
and then the dirt has to, it's not dirt, it's the appropriate soil. It's like cell culture media.
Yeah.
It has to be categorized and tested.
If you look at the investment that is required to set up a cultivation facility, I think a lab is bad at $1.4 million, but a cultivation facility, you're talking $10, $20, $30 million to build out these facilities. When you have that much investment, you do everything you can to make sure that you don't have these problems. You're going to almost engineer your water by using that high purity water, and you're going to mix in the nutrients specifically that the plants want. So it's very highly engineered.
It's like we did hybridomas to make monoclonal antibodies. You wouldn't take a chance on using untested media. I mean, now, Chris, if something goes wrong with ProVerde's lab, federal government says, oh, that's okay. We know you're a nice guy. We're not going to worry about it. I would think they'd come after you like they do every other clinical or testing lab. So you have to make sure for your own safety that your methods are validated. And
yeah, I think about that every day. There's a certain amount of liability there. We work directly with a lot of patients, and the youngest that we started working with, she was 13 months when we started working with her, pediatric epilepsy. And on cannabis therapy, her seizures were kept very well under control. And when I think about our ability to test pesticides or heavy metals, I always see her face. Because to me, that's what the ultimate, and over the years, that's the face I see when I think about my responsibility. Because if I miss a pesticide, if I miss a heavy metal, a lot of these toxins are cumulative. And so my hope is that she'll be on cannabis therapy for a good 60, 70 years, 80 years. But if those products that she's getting, especially in the formative years, are contaminated, that will have a huge, huge impact on her life.
I used to remember when the technicians would come, or my scientists would come up when we were running the GMP facility, and they'd say, should we do this? And I'd say, tell you what, I want you to ask yourself one question before you ever come to me. This monoclone, if I was injecting it into my mother, my spouse, or my child,
would you do it?
Would you do it? And what I found was 95% of the questions went away. They would come in and say, I don't want to miss the pesticide because it could be my kid.
Yep. And for us, and I'm sure my staff, my chemists and my technicians aren't always happy with me, but oftentimes when you do an experiment, you find that the results don't give you an answer, they give you more questions. Yeah. And so it is not uncommon on a daily basis to say, let's retest this, let's retest it a different way, let's confirm it on a different instrument, because this one test result doesn't satisfy me.
It hits that ambiguous, yeah.
It's not like on CSI, and as much as I love that show, it kind of gave the general public a misperception about what analytical testing is. Where you take a chip of paint and you put an instrument, and the instrument says, oh, that's from red paint from a '76 Ferrari. It doesn't work like that. It's an enormously challenging, I say every day that this stuff kicks my butt. It is really hard to make sure that you're doing a good job. And again, I'm always thinking about my social responsibility and potential liability. When I see this 13-month-old's face, I know what my charge is in terms of ensuring the safety of products. And it's that simple in terms of what should I do. It doesn't mean that the actual job of sorting it out is simple, but.
Now, there was a lot of confusion when people realized ProVerde and back then Sage Naturals actually existed.
We don't want marijuana on our streets.
Reefer madness. You know, we had one town meeting where they were talking about allowing hens and chickens, and it immediately went to rogue roosters buying marijuana down Main Street and running around with avian flu. And I was like, excuse me? But it was just that visceral, emotional reaction. How do you feel the whole process worked between you, Michael, and the town?
I think it was painful, but I think that we grew from our pain. So I think a lot of it was based out of ignorance. You know, we didn't try and set up our lab clandestinely. We went through the city hall, we filed for permits. We had articles in the newspaper about our operation, so we never tried to do this covertly. And yet I think a lot of people, even at the town hall meeting level, didn't understand what it is we do. And I never had the opportunity to interact with these people for the most part. And so through that whole commotion, I did have that opportunity. And I was confronted by people that said, well, you know, who do you make product for? Where are you selling it? I said, we don't sell it. I can't by law. Under Massachusetts regulation, I cannot produce or sell.
Well, Michael mentioned that his products have to be tested by an independent laboratory.
Which is us.
So it really kind of, you can't be editing your own work. You couldn't be selling a product and saying, yeah, let me give you a certificate, that's good stuff. Kind of a conflict.
Yeah. But so this whole process, as I said, it was painful, but it was a growing experience, I think, for both sides, the people who were afraid of what Sage and what ProVerde had to offer the town. And through that, I had the opportunity, whether it was on your show here with the town hall, meeting at some of the meetings with some of the other people who are on the opposing side, to share with them what it is we do. I've invited a number of them into our facility and have given tours and talks about what it is we do, what it looks like to have a responsible, regulated industry. And I think they grew from that, just as I grew from understanding, you know, what their concerns were, you know, and how we can better communicate to address those concerns. And, you know, maybe make our operations more transparent in the community. And certainly we've made a significant effort since then, as I said, opening up our facility to, especially at the regulator or the town hall meeting members, to come in and see what it looks like.
Well, I once asked, I said, how many people, Joe the pot dealer, send their batches of marijuana to be tested? I would venture to say you probably don't get a lot of business from the illicit marijuana seller.
You'd be surprised.
Really?
Yep, we do a lot for patients, but again, it's...
No, but that's patients.
Oh, you mean from the recreational?
Dealer, yeah, the recreational, the dealers.
People take this very seriously, and they want to show that their product is better than other people's. They have competitions to increase the terpene concentration. How much terpene is in there, how much THC is in there. They're very proud of their work, but oftentimes these people are still producing it for family and friends, and so they still have concerns about microbiological contaminants. If they are using pesticides, and I've had a number of them come to me and say, hey, I used a pesticide, I flushed the plant, so can you confirm that I flushed it all out? Unfortunately, pesticides don't flush out like that.
How do you flush?
You don't. But there was this misperception, and so, again, we had the opportunity to educate people.
Oh, I see. They're thinking it's on the surface, so you can just wash the leaves.
And, yeah, there's a certain amount you might be able to wash off, like you can your vegetables, but sometimes pesticides are systemic. They get into the plant tissue, and they're not going to easily wash out. And so, we have people who want to know more about their plants and their processes. So even for that adult user, we do a significant amount of testing because they're passionate about what they do. It's more than a hobby, it's truly a passion, and they want to...
They aren't standing on the street corner selling it.
No.
That's what I'm saying. The people who I most worry about is the ones that snuck it in from Mexico.
Yep.
And are just selling it on the street corners.
Yeah, those people are not testing with us.
Right.
And that's probably what you're going to get if you go down some dark alley. That's what you're going to get. And that was one of the issues I raised during the Milford town discussions, is that whether you're for or against marijuana, it is here. It has been here, and you can choose to turn a blind eye to it, but it's not going to go away.
But isn't it the same with alcohol? Whether you're going to drink or not, you want it regulated and as safe as possible.
Absolutely.
To me, the marijuana issue is a personal one.
Absolutely.
Just like alcohol, I don't drink that often. I tried pot in college, like a lot of us, and okay, yeah, it's probably been 20 or 30 years. But if my neighbor legally is going to use marijuana, I want to know that no bacteria I don't want them getting sick and then having to pick up the medical bills.
One of the issues I raised to a lot of the people during these discussions, I said, look, if you have a son or a daughter who's 30, 40 years old, they can make an informed decision. Do you want them to have access to high quality tested product? These are people you love. And many of them have already made the conscious decision that they are going to consume cannabis recreationally. Maybe that line between recreational and medical gets gray. If you're using it for anxiety or to help you sleep, is that truly medical? It depends on which state you're in. Because some states recognize different conditions. In some state, anxiety is not recognized as a treatable condition for cannabis. Anxiety, PTSD, these were not originally conditions that qualified for cannabis use. And so if you were in one state where PTSD was not recognized as a condition, but you were using it to help you get through the day, you're considered an adult user or a recreational user.
You're a drug
illicit. You're considered an illicit user.
But yet, the PTSD could have been people who put their lives on the line to guard our freedom.
Absolutely.
And who am I to tell that person?
It could be a victim of a car accident, of a robbery, of a rape.
Home abuse.
There's all kinds of things. When we talk about PTSD, we tend to think veterans, and that is a huge issue, a huge problem, and that's a huge pool of people that could benefit.
It could be innocent victims too.
But there's also this other thing that doesn't tend to come to the forefront of our mind when we talk about PTSD.
Now, the whole idea of recreational marijuana versus medical, a lot of people thought the recreational was just a little tiny nothing sliver of the potential market. Yet during the discussions, it seemed that it could dwarf the medical practice. Is that accurate, or?
I think it is, because again, I think you'll have, to go through the medical program, you have to go find a doctor, you have to pay $200 or $300 to get a card, you have to renew that every year. There's a lot of work and that goes through that. And if I'm a senior citizen who has arthritis,
Who's living on $1,200 a month?
yep, I'm not going to go sit in a room and wait for 4 hours to see a doctor and pay $200 to get a medical marijuana prescription, then go try and find a dispensary, which right now there's only 19 of them producers, so they're not conveniently located yet. On the other hand, if I can go, not in Milford, unfortunately, but to the next town over, and get a topical that is non-psychoactive, and my insurance won't pay for it, but it's probably cheaper than my copay,
Right.
and it alleviates the pain in my hand, technically you're using recreational marijuana. But, to me,
But
that's...
see, you brought something up where I don't believe people understand. You have the THC contingent and you have the CBD contingent. And you can actually engineer to say, I can get the therapeutic use out of these type products without getting high.
Yep. We have THC topicals that we've tested that also don't get you high, that do excellent job at arthritic conditions, neuropathy, things like that. So it depends on your route of administration. So if you smoke THC, you're going to get high. If you eat it, you're going to get high. But if you put it on your skin topically, in most cases you won't get high unless a producer has specifically engineered it to cross
Right.
the barrier. It's just going to act locally and will not get you stoned.
But it'd be really hard to take my grandmother and say, she's a druggie. The arthritis is hurting her and she's buying the formulation for the therapeutic value, but grandma's not going to get high. She doesn't want to. So she's going to pick the CBD heavy formulations that help her without making her
Yep.
go into la la land. Interesting.
I'd say a vast majority of our client base is not going for psychoactivity. They're going for reduced inflammation, reduced pain, migraines, just general quality of life
But I'll
improvement.
bet you if you ask 10 people, Main Street, Milford, 8 of them would say, if you're using marijuana in any way, shape, or form, you get high. People wouldn't know.
I mean, and that's frustrating because, I see, Sanjay Gupta. I mean, there's all these specials on TV, 60 Minutes, Nightline, that are highlighting these cases. So I think sometimes we see what we want to see. And we've been so, think about somebody says, hey, did you see this new model of car? You've never heard of it. But now that once you see one, now every other car you see is that model, because all of a sudden it's been brought to your attention. I think frequently we're bombarded with so much information, we tune a lot of it out, and we see what we want to see. As we can start to wake people up and start to highlight some of these cases or benefits, people start to say, oh, you know what? I think my neighbor has Crohn's disease and is using marijuana to treat it. I think my mother-in-law has arthritis, and she's actually, since she's been using that cannabis
Or
topical.
somebody having epileptic seizures that you don't see them having them anymore.
Yeah.
Or Parkinson's people that you don't see them, you're not getting that buildup against dopamine antagonists or whatever. The tremors are less.
So, I mean, I think that as a population, we're becoming more educated on the subject, and so the outlook is very exciting for opportunities. When we talk about it in the lab, it's always improving the quality of life. I don't always say, curing things. There's no magic bullet that's going to cure everything, but improving the quality of life. I can't tell you if this is going to cure you, but I pretty much can. I would bet money it's going to improve your quality of life.
Until we figure out the cure, this is going to help you.
Yep.
Now, is it my understanding that ProVerde is reaching out outside of the center of the universe here in Milford, that you're
We are.
that you're sponsoring like symposiums of absolute, top researchers?
Yeah, so being involved in the scientific community, I've had the fortunate opportunity to meet with researchers all over the world. I just came back from Israel, where I presented at a conference there. So I'm meeting people who are doing just phenomenal research on cannabis. And we've been trying to put together something here in Milford where we bring some of these researchers together. There's a number of groups that have done it. We see symposia here, especially in the Cambridge area, on cannabis. But we would like to do something here in Milford, host it at our facility, and host a discussion for some of these top world leaders in cannabis research for the Milford and the Massachusetts community.
That would be wonderful. I mean, bringing world leaders to Milford, not an easy feat.
I'm actually really proud of ProVerde, because ProVerde is a little lab in a little city in one of the smaller states in the U.S., and yet we have an international presence. We're working on projects in multiple countries, as far away as Africa. We are trying to expand into other states as well. We're growing very rapidly. Milford, for me, was a nucleation of my professional career with Waters. It was the nucleation of what is my partner Dorian and I is just, it's this gem that's just continues to grow and become beautiful in terms of what we can do for people around the world. And that's because testing is really hard. It's a lot of work, and we're committed to that work, and we're committed to bringing that to other locations that could use it.
I look forward to seeing that symposium, because as 28,000 of us know Milford's the center of the universe. That symposium could help the 6 billion that need to be educated. But thank you for everything you're doing.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for allowing me to share some of my views.
And as always, thank you for joining us. Thank you for learning, because there's a lot of things that we just didn't know about cannabis. Too many of us grew up believing you get high no matter what. Nobody ever understood CBD versus THC versus LMNOP, but there's a lot of good science going on that's helping people get the benefits without the side effects, because you may not want to get high. And I bet most people with arthritis or epilepsy or Parkinson's want the therapeutic value. They're not thinking about getting high. So thank you for joining. To our 6 loyal viewers, may God bless. May tomorrow be a healthier night than tonight.
Too long since I